The neighbourhood of Hammersmith has been for some time left in a constant state of alarm on the supposed appearance of an apparition every night, as the church clock struck 12 in the field adjoining Black Lion Lane, appearing as if covered with a shroud. These words are from an article in the Whole Packet newspaper on 17th of January 1804. Who or what was this apparition, who had an excellent sense of timekeeping and appeared at around the same time each evening for no apparent reason other than to spread fear? It had all started a few weeks earlier, at the end of 1803. One evening, a pregnant woman was making her way through the churchyard of St Paul's in Hammersmith, shivering in the cold, dark air of the December evening. Suddenly, a tall, white figure leapt out from behind a tombstone. She screamed and ran as fast as she could, but the spectre was faster. It chased after her and grabbed her in its arms. In the moments before she fainted, the thought uppermost in the woman's mind was that the being seemed surprisingly solid for a ghost. Some time later, a group of locals found her lying unconscious on the ground, picked her up, and carefully took her home. Tragically, she died just 2 days later, probably from the shock. A carriage driver named Mr. Russell was the next to fall prey to the phantom. He was driving his wagon and team of 8 horses one night when the figure jumped out from a shadowy alley, robed all in white. The terrified man fled, leaving his passengers behind to fend for themselves. By now, the local rumour mill was churning at full speed, grinding out theory after theory, each one more disconcerting than the last. Many believed it was the ghost of a man who had committed suicide the year before, but others were not convinced and speculated that a hoaxer was behind it. A group of vigilant citizens agreed to take turns keeping watch in the hope of catching the joker, but there were so many paths and alleyways in the area that it would have been too easy for someone with spooky shenanigans in mind to melt away out of sight. But one thing everyone agreed on was that it was no laughing matter. After all, a woman had already died after a traumatic encounter with a gown-clad ghoul, and that virtually made it, or perhaps him, a murderer. On the evening of 3rd of January 1804, a customs officer named Francis Smith lay in wait in Black Lion Lane, taking his turn to look out for the prankster. Nowadays the lane is densely populated and in close proximity to busier roads and roundabouts, but back in the early 19th century it was far more isolated, completely unlit and surrounded by fields. Waiting cautiously in a dark corner, he clutched his pistol tightly, hardly daring to blink in case he missed a glimpse of the ghostly white figure. No doubt the quietness of the lane and the chilly night air played on his mind, and it would have been an unimaginative man indeed who could have remained completely certain that the thing they were hunting was indeed of an earthly nature. At 10:30 p.m, Francis Smith got to see the apparition for himself. The figure turned into the lane covered entirely in white. In fact, the white garment seemed so bright as to almost be glowing. Before Smith realised what had happened, he had pulled the trigger and fired his pistol at the apparition. It immediately crumpled to the floor. As he neared the fallen shape, terrible realisation crept over Francis Smith, at the same speed as a bloom of red blood spread over the being's white clothing. He had shot and killed a human man. Smith gave himself up immediately at the nearest police station, and the victim was identified as 22-year-old bricklayer Thomas Millwood. He'd been dressed in brand new, freshly washed clothes, including linen trousers, a flannel waistcoat and an apron, all of them spotlessly white, as was the custom for bricklayers in those days. Smith was charged with murder and stood in the dock at the Old Bailey less than a week later. The court understood the defendant's predicament and saw his obvious remorse for his hasty decision to pull the trigger. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death as a matter of procedure, but was given a reprieve by the king the very same evening. He served only 6 months in jail before being released. 6 days after Millwood was shot dead, the real hoaxer was caught, thanks to a tip from someone living nearby who'd already had suspicions but was compelled to come forward after learning that the affair had led to such a tragedy. It turned out to be shoemaker James Graham, who admitted on questioning to have been wrapping himself in a white blanket every night and jumping out at people. He was taken to the magistrate to answer for his actions, which were described as wanton and manifold outrages of the public peace. When asked the reason for the malicious prank, Graham said that it was out of revenge, as his apprentice shoemakers had frightened his children with ghostly tales in the past. It was a pity that he decided to take out his anger on the unsuspecting locals of Hammersmith, rather than simply giving his apprentices a good scare. Despite frightening a pregnant woman to death and indirectly causing the shooting of Thomas Millwood, Graham seems to have escaped punishment for his mischief. The case is now enshrined in the annals of British legal history thanks to Francis Smith's unusual murder defence, which saw him avoid the noose because he believed he was shooting a ghost.